Welcome to Casual Politics, Baroness Williams. Thank you very much for accepting my request, and I'm very grateful to you. You need no introduction. You've been Member of Parliament for 35 years. You've been Education Secretary and Paymaster General, and then you went on to form the so-called Gang of Four.
The party was called the Social Democratic Party.
Yes. SDP, and so my first question, and then you joined Lib Dems in 1988.
I didn't join them, they didn't exist.
Yes.
We formed them by
them.
combining the Social Democratic Party with the old Liberal Party, and then it became called the Liberal Democrats.
Well, with David Owen and Bill Rogers.
No, with Bill Rogers, he was part of it. Only David Owen decided he didn't
to
like the merger, and he decided to continue with a part of the new party. But as I had always feared, there was no room in the middle for yet another party. So his breakaway party didn't live for long.
That's absolutely. And my first question: how did you get involved into politics?
Very young. My father was stood for Parliament for Labour on 3 occasions. He didn't win any of them, but Labour wasn't elected very much in the 1930s, which is when he stood. So he brought me up in a political household. We discussed politics all the time, and of course it was a pretty acute time just before, during, and after the Second World War. So that's how I began getting involved in politics. I joined the Labour Party when I was 16. Quite rapidly became an organiser for 1 or 2 fairly hopeless seats. It was a very good way to learn about politics, and then I stood myself for Parliament when I was 23, but didn't get elected until I was a bit older. Towards the end of that period, I finally got elected for the marginal seat of Hitchin in Hertfordshire.
In 1964.
1964.
And in terms of women representation, what has changed in Parliament since 1964?
Not much. The funny thing is that the first big change was when women first came into Parliament. After they were given the vote in 1928. Very few women, very small number, mostly single women or widows, not women who had to bring up families as well at the same time. And that didn't change very much, just a handful of women, until 1964. In 1964 we finally reached the staggering figure of 23 women in Parliament out of 630, so not even 5%. And it stayed that way for the next few years again. And the next really big leap was in 79. So there were really a very small number of women for all those years. Usually there was one in the cabinet. There was almost never more than one, with one exception, and the exception was Harold Wilson. He was one of those rare prime ministers who was entirely meritocratic. He appointed people on the basis of how well they did the job. Not on the basis of gender, not on the basis of colour, not on the basis of religion. And he was unusual in that respect, because even after him there were prime ministers who appointed only one woman, or not even one woman to the cabinet. In fact, John Major didn't appoint a single woman to the cabinet until the press exploded and said he was totally out of date.
And then Gillian Shepherd.
And he had Gillian Shepherd, but he didn't have anybody at first.
Yes. And do you think that now we should have more women, as we should select more women as candidates for all the parties?
Yes, but I'm not myself a believer in quotas, because the trouble is if you have, at the very beginning I think that's as a starting point, yes, but I think to continue with quotas is a mistake, because it implies that women have to be given a special sort of position in order to make it as a Member of Parliament. Britain isn't very good. I mean, most Western European countries are better than this country in terms of the representation of women. I mean, unexpectedly, for example, Spain, which on the face of it, one wouldn't have thought likely, given its history, to be particularly sympathetic, but it is. It actually has got quite a lot of women in senior positions in the cabinet. And of course, we don't need to tell the story of Germany, because there it is. But again, a country with a very patriarchal history and heritage. Surprising that a woman should become a Chancellor of Germany. But there we are. I think things have changed a great deal. Perhaps not as much in Britain as in some other countries.
Harold Wilson, in your memoir, you say that he was not very sociable. So did he lack that kind of communication with his ministers, and especially you as a woman minister?
I don't think it wasn't that he wasn't so sociable, but he wasn't somebody who went in for parties. He didn't go around sort of being part of society. He was very much an academic in many ways. No, I think he just didn't make a distinction between men and women. Now, he was interested in people, and he was interested in, particularly, I think, in their intellectual capacity. So I didn't talk to him a great deal. I talked to him a bit. But I was quite impressed by the fact that he had this extraordinary capacity to detach himself from personal aspects, and he seemed to be a man without prejudice.
And do you think that he was right to suspend the collective responsibility in 1975?
Yes, he was.
The EU referendum.
I think it was very brave of him. He had a cabinet which had people strongly committed to the European community, as it then was. He had others who were strongly opposed to it, and he decided that for him the very first and essential priority was to hold the party together. And so he took the risk of saying, not you can't oppose what I think, but rather saying you have an open argument, and it's only when we make the final decision that collective responsibility for the cabinet will apply. And it actually worked very well. I think it didn't split the country in a way as happened in some other European countries where a referendum issue has come up, where people then bitterly fight about that, because I think it was a precedent that was actually very successful, and it didn't split the cabinet after the argument and when the decision was made in the referendum by as you probably know, about 60% majority in favour of staying in the European Union. He was then able to pick up the reins and continue governing for another year or two without there being disastrous consequences.
And when James Callaghan replaced Harold Wilson, he appointed you as Education Secretary.
Right.
And you replaced grammar schools by comprehensive. And some people, they argue that it wrecked the education system. So do you still stand by your legacy?
Well, let me go back to the beginning. I wasn't the author of the comprehensive system. The author of the comprehensive system was Anthony Crosland, the famous socialist economist. And he was the man who originally started the process of saying to the local authorities, at that time schools were governed by the counties, local, not national. Tony Crosland, said that he couldn't force schools to become comprehensive, but that any new school or any school in a town which had a rising population would have to be comprehensive. They wouldn't be given the money to build a school unless they were comprehensive. But he didn't try to abolish all the existing grammar schools. No law to that effect was ever passed. So what happened was that because there was a great deal of unease among the general public with the so-called 11+ exam, which decided who was bright enough to go to a grammar school, which was a bit like the gymnasium in Germany, and who wasn't. And that decision was made when you were 11. And not only that, but the number that went to grammar school was only about 15% of the population. It was not an appropriate structure for a world which was becoming increasingly a skilled world, one where people needed to know a lot about mathematics, to know a lot about science and so forth. It wouldn't have lasted, I think, for very long. But the comprehensive school, which enabled all young men and women to at least try for the exams that would lead on to university, they didn't all get there, but they would all try for it, simply widened by huge proportions the number of young people who had higher skills. And that, for a country which was trying to be part of the modern world, was absolutely essential in my view. So the arguments were not just ideological, they were also quite clearly economic.
And what do you make of Michael Gove education reforms? Do you think that it was continuity of your policy?
No, it clearly wasn't. There was one good thing about it, the idea of greater autonomy for the head teacher, I think a good idea. I didn't like much of the rest of his policies. For example, I think were much too national. I think essentially, if you're living in a modern world, you've got to have an education which enables boys and girls to understand that they are European citizens as well as British citizens, that also enables them to begin to understand something about the global changes in places like China, India, the rest of the world. And I therefore regret the fact that I think Mr. Gove, who's a very bright man, went back to a much more Anglo-centric kind of history, a much more limited kind of curriculum. With that, I don't agree.
And you were also, when you were Education Secretary, Paymaster General,
Yes.
and you chaired many national executive meetings. And
No, I didn't. That's not right. The National Executive was a party
Yeah.
committee. I didn't chair them. I was a member of it,
Yeah.
but I didn't chair. And what I did chair was something quite different, which was governmental committees, looking at things like the devolution of power to Scotland. I was the chairman of that committee. Looking at industrial democracy, I was the chairman of that committee. So being Paymaster General gives you a kind of, like a sort of miniature prime ministerial role, where above all what you're doing is chairing meetings about contentious issues, but they're government issues, not party issues. I never chaired a party factor. I mean, the factor that led us to create the SDP was Nazi Europe. I mean, the European issue was key, it was central. All those of us who went to form a new party, when we decided we couldn't stay in the Labour Party anymore, one of the major reasons was that the Labour Party adopted a policy of leaving the European Union, what the European Community then was. We were all strongly pro-European. We therefore could not stay in a party which said our policy is to get out. So we didn't accept that. That meant, I don't think it had anything to do with the Labour Party not being elected. What had to do with the Labour Party not being elected for some time was the move shift very sharply to the left, which was led essentially by a powerful Trotskyite group called the Militant Tendency. And the British public is not a very left or right inclined public, it's a very much a centre inclined public. So I think the reason that we didn't expect ourselves to get elected, but of course we then eventually ended up in the coalition and continued to play a substantial part in the governing of the country.
if you hadn't lost your...
I got maybe 5 minutes.
Okay. If you hadn't lost your seat in 1979, would you still remain as in the Labour Party?
Oh God, had nothing to do with it. Nothing whatsoever to do with it. What had to do with it was that we were already on track to say, if the Labour Party again commits itself to getting out of the European Union, and at the time this was 79, we had just lost the election. So here was the Labour Party in opposition. And people like Roy Jenkins and David Owen and Bill and Rogers and I all said, if they decide once again after the election, and after the referendum, which after all said that 60% of the British public wanted to stay in the European Union, we can't stay in a party that simply rejects the referendum when it called for the referendum. So we made it quite clear that if that were to happen, we wouldn't be able to stay in. And in 1981, not till then, the Labour Party executive decided again to leave the European Union. And to us that was a double blow, because it was not only getting out of Europe, it was also rejecting the decision of the British people they themselves had called for. And so we didn't think we could possibly stay.
And with SDP, you hold the balance of power in Westminster. Do you think that UKIP will do the same after the general election?
UKIP's been terribly overplayed. UKIP will get very few seats in Parliament.
But no balance of power in Westminster?
Not a chance.
Not a chance.
And the Labour Party couldn't work with them. I don't think the Conservatives would find it easy. But, I mean, please don't fall for the absurd exaggerations of the media, because UKIP will be lucky to get 10 seats. I don't think it will get 10 seats myself.
And your party as well will have less MPs than the Greens.
Oh,
Is it worrying?
Oh, we certainly got less than the Greens.
Yes.
The Greens are lucky to get 2. No. We'll get at least 30, probably more like 35 seats. We'll be 3 times bigger than any other party that isn't the 2 old parties. So no, I think you forgive me, but I think you have to look at that again. It's just not going to happen.
And then my last question is that Scotland, what do you make of after what will happen to Scotland after the
Well, that's a much more interesting
Scottish
question.
referendum?
The SNP, the Scottish Nationalist Party, is likely to win a lot of seats from Labour in Scotland. It may be one or two from us. And that means that it will be the question will be therefore whether either the Labour or Conservative parties feel they can work with the Scottish National Party. It's not likely. The SNP has already said they won't work with the Conservatives, and they have hinted they might work with Labour. But don't forget, this would be an election where they had just won a whole lot of seats from Labour, so there won't be great enthusiasm among the Labour Party for working closely with the SNP. It would be a difficult thing to do.
Thank you very much, Baroness Williams, for your time. It was a pleasure. Thank you.